to our talk this afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us. My name is James Fahn. I'm a lecturer at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, where I teach a class on international environmental reporting. And I'm also the director of the Earth Journalism Network, which I'll talk about in a moment. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for joining us for this talk, whether you're online or here in person. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's great to be in this fascinating country of Greenland, so thanks for all the hospitality. I've been a journalist covering environmental issues now for nearly 30 years. I got my start working in Thailand in 1990, working for a local newspaper and a TV station. I started off as a science and technology reporter, and then gradually switched over to writing full-time about the environment. I was living in Thailand at a time it was undergoing a really rapid economic transformation. The economy is growing about 12% a year, and it was a very exciting time. There was a lot of positive changes happening, but there was also a lot of problems that were emerging: pollution, traffic, all kinds of resource extraction and economic exploitation. And it always seemed to me that we should be able to have the growth, have the positive things from development, but we should be able to also kind of reduce the negative things. And so that's why I got really interested in covering environmental issues, and I worked with the newspaper to set up the environment desk at the newspaper. We ended up hiring 5 Thai reporters. We covered all sorts of environment and natural resource issues around Southeast Asia. We did a lot of investigative reports. We uncovered oil companies dumping mercury in the Gulf of Thailand, illegal loggers smuggling timber into Thailand from Burma, hotel investors encroaching on national parks, orchid smugglers, wildlife smugglers, timber smugglers, smuggling whatever you can think of. It was a very exciting time, and we expanded into television. I had a weekly feature program on Thai TV I was a host of, called Rainan CKL, or Green Report, and we again covered all kinds of environmental issues there. After a while, I decided it was time to return to the U.S., where I was originally from. And we were greatly impacted by the financial crisis that hit Asia in 1997, and we weren't quite able to do the coverage we were doing before. And I went back to school, and I ended up working at the Ford Foundation for a couple of years, and then I started up my current project, my current job, which is called the Earth Journalism Network. We're a project of Internews. Internews is a global media development organization that supports local press and local media around the world. So I run basically the environment department for Internews, which we call the Earth Journalism Network, and which is also now a professional association of journalists dedicated to covering the environment, dedicated to this mission that you see on the screen here, improving the quality and quantity of environmental reporting worldwide. And we've grown over the last, it's almost 15 years now, we've grown. We now have over 12,000 members from more than 130 countries. And I'll be talking a bit more about Earth Journalism Network, or EJN, as we sometimes call it, throughout this talk. Before I start, I just want to say, we have, for people here in the audience, I really welcome this as a kind of discussion. If you have any questions or a comment, please raise your hand and let's talk it out, because I really value the interaction. I'm sorry we can't interact as much with those of you online, but if you ever want to send me emails or some other way to ask me questions, I'm always happy to interact. I thought we'd just start by talking briefly about environmental issues, and especially how they play out in developing countries. Although I think these lessons that I've learned from working, I ended up living and working in Asia for 14 years. So that's really where I spent the bulk of my career, although now I am based in California. But I think these lessons that I learned, I think they're pretty applicable worldwide, maybe here in Greenland too. And I would say, first of all, that environmental issues, some of them come from too little development, and some from too much development. I think most of us are familiar with those problems that come from too much development. For instance, air pollution that's caused by too many cars, or cars that emit too much exhaust. That's an example of too much development or unplanned development, not poorly planned development. But there's also air pollution problems caused by too little development. We can say, for instance, if you're living in a small house in a rural area and you're cooking over a dirty stove, some kind of cook stove, you're inhaling indoor air pollution. That can be a serious problem, a serious health problem, and that could potentially be solved by upgrading to a cleaner cook stove. So you can say there are some issues that are a result of too little development. But I think the key lesson that I learned from living and working in Thailand is, sometimes environmental issues are perceived or portrayed as a luxury issue, as something that the rich care about, but the poor not so much. The poor have to worry more about survival, livelihood, and so on. And of course, to a certain extent, I think that can be true. I mean, it is true that if you're lacking for money or security, your first goal is to support yourself and your family. And sometimes you have to do damaging things, or you feel you have to do damaging things to the environment in order to survive. But what I found most of all, in almost every single issue I covered, whether it was climate change or biodiversity or fisheries or forestry or pollution, that is almost always the poor who suffer most of all from these problems. They're the ones who are most exposed, the most vulnerable, the least able to adapt, and they suffer the most from these environmental problems. So if you're a fisherman and there's overfishing and your fish stocks are declining, you're the one who's going to lose your livelihood. If you're a farmer and the trees are being cut down in your watershed, you're the one who's going to lose your water supply or lose the ability to forage in the forest. If you're being affected by climate change, or if you're being exposed to pollution, often maybe you're living closer to polluted areas. It's harder for you to move away. If you're wealthy, you do have the opportunity to migrate more easily, get away from pollution. And it's the same with climate change. Wealthy people are going to they'll just have more resources, better able to adapt. So it's not really fair, but the fact is, if you care about poverty, and if you want to reduce poverty, then we should all be striving to protect the environment better, because again, I do believe the environment affects poor people most of all. And this is another point I want to make about environment, which is that sometimes we think about environment as it's how resources are used. Do we manage our forests sustainably? Do we manage our fish stocks sustainably? Do we, do we use proper pollution cleaning equipment on our machines and cars? But it's not just about how resources are used. It's also about who gets to use them. And that's particularly true when there's scarcity of resources. And it really becomes then a justice issue, a social justice issue. And sometimes people forget that. Also, what we're seeing around the world is that these environmental issues that are coming to the fore, they're happening at a faster pace than ever before. Back when when Great Britain industrialized, it took them perhaps 100 years. When the U.S. underwent industrialization, maybe 50 years. Today, countries are industrializing, developing in a single generation. And that makes a really big difference, because it means that the people who are in power, they grew up in a very different world. And they may not be able to address these issues or understand these issues as well as people who grew up facing environmental problems all their lives. Finally, another really important point that I like to stress about environment is that management is made very difficult because of corruption. And we see this over and over again, is that resources are used or abused by the people who control them to seek rents, to make money. So, for instance, you can imagine that a politician who might give out a lucrative mining contract to a favored businessman who in turn gives a kickback to the politician. And in that case, it's very, very hard to monitor, say, the pollution from that mine and make sure it's being managed properly. Or they might give out a timber concession or a fishing concession. And again, the resource may be abused for the benefit of the businessman and his backers, but that makes managing those fish stocks very difficult. So over and over again, we see this as a problem. And it may be obvious to some of you, it may not be, but this is really a big problem in covering environmental issues and reporting on environmental issues and managing them. So at the Earth Journalism Network, we focus for the most part on developing countries. This is where I believe the future of our planet will be decided. The developing world is home to 80% of the world's population. Most of the world's biodiversity is in the developing world. It's where the fastest growing economies lie, and it's where the most pollution now, by and large, is being emitted. If you look at, for instance, climate change pollution these days. Of course, historically, it's a different matter. But the point I want to make is that, our environmental future will be decided in the developing world, and so it's really important that we understand how environmental issues play out there, and how to better report on these issues so that hopefully resources can be sustainably managed. As part of our work with EJN, I mentioned how many journalists we have, over 12,000 members. We've trained over 5,000 journalists around the world on a wide variety of issues. We've produced over 8,000 stories during these activities. And that's, of course, just during our activities. Afterwards, the journalists go home and they hopefully produce many more stories of better quality on these topics. But we're not just a network of individuals, we're a network of networks. And these are some of the organizations we partnered with in places like Indonesia, India, China, Philippines, Thailand, all over the world, really, South America, Africa. And the idea is we help set up these local networks of environmental journalists, and they become our local partners. They obviously can work in the local language, and they understand these local issues much better. And we can help support them with funding, with technology, with any kind of training or mentoring. And then hopefully these groups can become institutions in their own right, and many of them have. They become legally registered. They get funding from other sources, and they really can support local journalists, whether or not we are working with them. So that's part of our kind of what we call our network journalism approach. But why do we want to work with environmental media? And these are some of the basic reasons why we believe the media plays such an important role when it comes to the environment. Perhaps most obviously, we can explain the long-term environmental impacts, the causes of environmental problems. We can explain solutions, hopefully, how these problems can be addressed. And we can do so by reaching diverse audiences. Because the mainstream media, although obviously it's a shifting landscape, it still does have a very broad, diverse audience. And while environmental groups and research institutions, other kinds of actors, they play a very important role in terms of environmental communications, but still, most of their audience tends to be already converted. They're preaching to the choir, as we like to say. So with the media, if we can get the mainstream media or other types of media today, social media, digital media, alternative media, if we can get them to report better on the environment, then hopefully you can reach a much broader, more diverse audience. It's also, the media plays a really important role as a watchdog. Remember I mentioned how corruption and political political activities can really make environmental management very difficult. Well, it's often the journalists who expose those scandals and who uncover how public policies may be manipulated for the benefit of certain interests, but to the detriment of the public and natural resources. So one of our main jobs really is to one of our keys really is to see when there's an environmental issue, who is benefiting from that, right? Who's profiting? Who's getting the money? And who's suffering? Who's being impacted by the pollution? You've probably heard the expression "follow the money," right? Made famous in Watergate. All the president's men. Well, we have to follow the money, but we also have to follow the pollution. We find out who is suffering from that, and from our standpoint as journalists, this results in a really interesting story. Usually you have this social justice angle. You have a really good story that you can report on. And you're also, of course, exposing, what's going on in the world around us. We can inform the public. We can inform the policymakers. Hopefully everyone involved can end up making better decisions with better information. I do believe we'll have a better environment. But we got a lot of problems in the media. The main problem is we lack time, money. Sometimes we lack scientific expertise. It's really hard to cover the environment. It takes a lot of effort, and it does take money sometimes. And we just lack those things. And so that's part of our role with the Earth Journalism Network, is to try and provide that. Another problem with the media is that we tend to focus on the middle class, on the urban sector, the business sector. We're not so good at covering the issues that affect the poor, the rural sector. Why is that? I want to ask you in the audience here. Why do you think it is that the media, why are we so focused more on the middle class and not so much on what's going on in the countryside? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Certainly, that's true. Yeah, most of us tend to be based in the cities or near the cities. We know there's, maybe we come from the middle class, so that's what we know. We can report on that more easily. Any other thoughts? Yes? That's true too. Yes, the audience is middle class, so you could say the media, definitely we want to reach middle class audiences. Tom, did you have a thought? That's a third point. Yes, exactly. We are funded by advertisers or sometimes by subscriptions. But when I was working at the newspaper in Thailand, our ads were coming from real estate companies, from oil companies, from mining companies, and I was definitely aware of the irony. Here I was reporting on these issues, in the meantime, my salary is basically coming from the companies. So, that is a problem, and I think those of us who cover the environment, we need to be aware of that. And often it's left up to us to cover these issues and to cover vast swaths of the countryside that are not really being covered that effectively otherwise. And that's a challenge. Also, the media were very good at covering crises, breaking news, right? Volcanoes erupting in Hawaii, hurricanes hitting Houston. We're not so good at covering incremental change. We're not so good at the slow changes over time that end up having big impacts. And of course, that is often the main characteristic of environmental stories, whether it's biodiversity loss or climate change or what's happening to the oceans. So it can be really hard to come up with hard-hitting headlines and exciting stories, sensational stories that our editors are often looking for. We're also not very good at covering solutions. So again, we're good at covering problems. We love problems. We were just talking about this the other day with Heather, that if it bleeds, it leads. It's still true. But sometimes you want to report on solutions. Our editors are not so interested. I've had cases where I tried to report on some really interesting NGO workers or scientists who are doing really interesting work. And I had one reporter tell me, it's not so interesting. They're too goody two shoes. It's not, there's not enough depth there. And that's pretty discouraging, of course. So we need to find ways to get solutions into the stories alongside the problems. And we can do that, but it takes some strategy. We also face a lot of pressure and threats from vested interests. Most of us who work on these issues, we've been threatened at one time or another. I wasn't given death threats, but I was threatened with being kicked out of Thailand for my reporting. And another time, I was with a group of journalists, and we were covering an illegal logging scandal on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. And there were a whole bunch of logging trucks trying to flee into Thailand from the Burmese army was attacking this border area to close down this illegal logging. And we're driving along this dirt road where all the logging trucks are lined up. And there was one time we passed this really nice fancy car, a big 4-wheel drive vehicle. And I said to my friends, hey, that's it. That's the Godfather. This is a guy who's running this whole illegal logging scandal. Let's get out and talk to him. And all my friends say, no way. If you try and talk to him, you'll never feel safe again the rest of your life. You'll never know when someone's just going to come up behind you and put a bullet in your head. And you know what? They were right. I didn't interview him. I'm happy to say eventually his name got exposed anyway. But sometimes we do have to kind of let discretion be the better part of valor. And this is a continuing problem. And it's something we also work with our journalists to try and protect them or give them public support when they are threatened. Sometimes by giving international public support, we can really help protect them, give them a higher profile. Another problem, I'm sad to say, sometimes we get resistance within the newsroom. Sometimes our own supervisors don't really understand the environment, don't want us to report on it, don't think it's that interesting. And, half our job, I sometimes feel, is just educating our own editors to make sure they understand why these issues are so important. We struggle with some issues like advocacy. Sometimes we get accused of being too green, or maybe sometimes not green enough. And it's a hard thing to know is when, at what point are you going over the line from being a kind of neutral, objective journalist to being more of an advocate or an activist. And everyone has their own definition of how you just make that distinction. We struggle a lot with uncertainty, issues like climate change. We don't always know what's going to be happening. And so, it's hard to report on the future when there is uncertainty about it. And so covering these issues like climate change present a special challenge, but it is really important. Here's a famous journalist. He's the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian, a famous newspaper. And they've done some great work over the years on climate change. But he also notes this problem, that the story is so big, climate change, and it's incremental, doesn't change from day to day. So it's hard to capture as a journalist. And, sometimes that can be discouraging. But we try to overcome that, and that begins by making sure that journalists understand why the climate is changing. I hope most of you are familiar with the greenhouse effect. I think I probably won't go into this. I think for this audience, you probably understand that already. But the problem is caused by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That acts kind of like a blanket, increasing the average temperature of our atmosphere. And here you can see, the measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as measured in Hawaii. And if you look more closely, you'll see that each year it goes up and down. Does anyone know why that is? Why does it make that curve going up and down each year in the winter and the summer? Ice? Nope. Summer, winter, but what exactly is happening in the summer and winter? What is that a signal of? Yes, trees. This is the signal of the northern boreal forest. And in the summer, it's blooming and it's capturing carbon dioxide. In the winter, it's exhaling. This is basically the breathing of our planet that you're seeing in the signal there. It's pretty amazing, actually. And then, of course, we see all these impacts of that: increased air temperature, decreased snow cover, change in glacial mass. Of course, we get a lot of that in Iceland. Sea ice declining, sea level rising. One indicator after another showing that we are the impacts of our global warming. Some impacts we understand very well. We know there's going to be more summer heat waves. We know sea levels rising, more wildfires, coral reefs are dying. Other impacts we think are going to happen, and then some we're more uncertain about, things like what species are going to go extinct and how far our tropical disease is going to spread. So we know the climate is changing, but the exact impacts are uncertain, and that makes climate change reporting quite challenging. And so, talking about what makes it so difficult, well, I think the first thing we have to say is the primary challenge is, how do we take this global issue and turn it into a local story? Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about storytelling when we talk about journalism. And of course, here in Greenland, you have a very rich storytelling tradition. And so you can build on that. And there's these traditions all over the world. So we need to get journalists and other communicators to build on these traditions and tell the story of climate change as something that people can understand and relate to in their own lives. And we need to be able to convey that a lot of these impacts aren't a certainty, but we're making the world more risky. We're increasing the probability of more severe storms. We're increasing the probability of more heat waves. And we have to explain what is risk and what that means for people. And this is really difficult. We need to distinguish between local and global causes, right? So if the fish stocks are declining in southern Greenland, as we've heard about, is that because the fish are migrating north due to climate change and change in patterns and changes in the food chain that the fish are feeding on? Or is that because there's been too much overfishing in southern Greenland? We don't always know. And to know that, we need to work with scientists, and the scientists need to be able to hopefully tell us what are the causes. And it might be a mix of those things. And then we have to report on that in a way that's, accurate. We also find it difficult to report, especially on weather events, because we know that climate change is, say, exacerbating, making hurricanes and storms more intense, increasing storm surge. But it's hard to link individual weather events with climate change. You cannot say Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Maria was caused by climate change. That's the wrong way to put it. But you can say they were exacerbated by climate change. Maybe sometimes you can say it is more likely to happen, or certainly it's more severe because of climate change. So actually, this is a really interesting aspect of climate science. The scientists are getting better at what we call attribution. And sometimes we can now say that, for instance, the drought in Australia that took place in, I think it was 2013, that can now be attributed to climate change. So we're getting better at that, but it takes time and it's difficult. Any questions about this? Okay. So here are the key messages I like to give out. And if there's one thing or three things you take away from this talk, I hope this will be what you remember. First of all, I firmly believe that environment and climate change are likely to end up being the biggest story of this century. When people look back on this century, your grandkids or your great grandkids, and they're wondering, and they look at the history, they're going to say, well, what were you doing about climate change? What were you reporting on? Or why weren't you doing more? This, I think, really could be the story of the century. So we, as journalists, we have this tremendous opportunity now to report on this story and really make a difference by doing so. But the causes and the impacts of climate change are not the whole story. There's a lot more out there. Adaptation is a big part of the story, the changing economy, changing society. This is a much bigger story than just the environment. And that leads to the third key message, which is this is not just an environment story. It's not even just a science story. This is a story you can report on from so many different angles. And that's really important for us as journalists because, again, our editors, they get really bored of these environment stories. So we need to find different, more creative ways to tell this story. And the nice thing is, it is such a big story that we can do so, that we can come up with all these different angles. And I want to ask you in the audience, what do you guys think? What are some different angles? Obviously, it's a science story, it's an environment story. What other angles can we pitch our stories around? Yes? Right. Great. Thank you. So I'll just repeat that for our online audience that that it's you did your thesis on climate coverage in the Greenland's newspapers. Is that right? And Greenland's media. Is that correct? And you found that coverage of climate change increased up to 2009, culminating in the Copenhagen summit, COP15. And then after that, did it decline or? Yeah, it declined. Yeah, I think we saw that a lot around the world too. It then kind of built up again around COP21 in Paris, and the Paris Climate Agreement. It does seem to come and go. And you were saying that you noticed 10 different angles that climate can be covered through. Is that right? Yeah. So I'll just go through some of them. For instance, it's, I think a really underreported aspect of climate change are the health impacts. As the climate warms and certain vectors of disease, whether it's mosquitoes or bacteria or other things, can survive through less harsh winters. And we're seeing the spread of many diseases that were formerly confined to the tropics, now spreading into more temperate latitudes. And I think that's a really important impact, and it's not reported enough. That's something I would like to see more of. So I think climate change is a health story. It's also a business story. I mean, the whole business of renewable energy is a huge growth industry around the world. And so, but it's not just renewable energy. There are all kinds of technologies related to climate change or adaptation to climate change. And so there's a lot of business opportunities involved when it comes to climate change. You can make really good business stories about it. So if your own editor isn't so interested in the story, you go to the business editor and say, hey, I got this great business story. I'm going to do a story on, say, solar power or wind power and potential for new business in this area. It's a finance story as well. How are you going to pay for all this new development? So that's big business. I mean, believe me, climate finance is a really important issue. It's a legal issue now. We know about the Paris Climate Agreement. This is an agreement that was signed by 195 nations around the world. So, and then of course all these countries, they pass their own laws relating to climate change. So there are lots of legal issues. And then it becomes a political story, right? I mean, politics are usually like the front page of the newspaper. They usually dominate the front page. Well, this climate politics is a big deal right now. And so you can turn your story into, obviously, in my country, the U.S., climate politics have become a really big story now because we have a president who seems to deny the fact that climate change is happening. It's a social story. I mean, it's changing our culture and our societies in ways that we might not have predicted. And so it can be a religious story as well, because there's some aspects of environmental stewardship that really depends on the way we view the world around us, which is often dominated by religion. It can be an international story. It can be one of my favorites, some of the best stories I've seen, not just about climate change, but about other topics like fish. Of course, fishery is a really big issue here in Greenland and many other places we work around the world. Some of the best stories I've seen on fish come in the food and dining section of the newspaper, right? Story on seafood. Well, you get into where does seafood come from. You talk about how fish stocks are managed, and you get into a lot of really important environmental issues. And food and dining are really popular stories now in the media. Most magazines, newspapers have sections on that. They also have travel sections, right? Climate change is affecting a lot of the places we like to visit. You might want to go visit those coral reefs, that Great Barrier Reef now, because in another 50 years, it will still be there, but it might be mostly dead. So all these stories, money, stories now about personal finance. Maybe you need to change your stock portfolio based on how climate change is affecting the business world. So the point is, there are lots of different angles, and we work with journalists to help them come up with all these different angles and find new ways to tell this big story of our century. It can be challenging, but we do need to make climate change sexy. Again, we use different angles. We use different sources, use a lot of sources. Most important, I think, is we need to make climate change personal. Stories, the most popular stories are about people, other people, and interesting people. And so we often tailor our stories. We'll report on interesting activists or scientists or politicians who have taken up the subject. And that we find get the most traction with our audiences if we can report on interesting people working on climate change or on related issues. Also, reporting on places that are being affected by climate change. Again, coral reefs are a really good example. But also here in Greenland, of course, climate change is affecting the ice cap. People are really interested in Greenland, I believe. And I think it'd be, so a really good way to report on climate change could be to report on how it's affecting a place like Greenland or other maybe remote places that people aren't very familiar with. Wildlife. People love animals. In fact, I have a friend who runs a business that it's called Good Guide, and it gives consumers information on the products that they buy as to whether these products are good for the environment or good for society and good for health. And what they found by this through their consumer research is that people will pay more money to buy healthy food for their pets than they will for their kids, right? So think about that. So basically what they're saying through consumer action, that people care more about their pets, about their animals, than they do about their own kids. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but the fact is people really like animals. So if you want to report on climate change, what's happening with animals, what's happening here in Greenland with the narwhal, what's happening with the polar bears. Obviously, has been probably an overtold story, maybe in some places, but people are really interested in these big charismatic animals. So if you can tell stories about them, that can generate a lot more audience. But so if you're a hunter, then you need to know what's happening with how climate change is affecting polar bears, so you can still tell a good story about it. It's just maybe a different angle than you would in other places. Yeah. I already talked about food and health. How about gardening? Look, got a lot of gardening people out. Maybe not so much in Greenland, but certainly in South Greenland, you got gardening, farming, and you're going to have increased opportunities for that, right? Now, that could be a really interesting angle for local media coverage. Whatever you're going to do, it's really important not to use jargon, and this is a big problem we face. You know, one of the problems we often face as journalists is scientists. We have a tough time sometimes working with scientists. They feel that often that maybe we don't tell the story as precisely as they'd like. We do. In fact, I believe journalists and scientists are very strong allies, and we both have the same goal. We're out there to report the truth, to discover the truth and tell the truth. But I do believe scientists care a lot more about precision, whereas journalists, we believe accuracy is important, but we need to explain things in a way that scientists often fail to do. I mean, the fact is a lot of scientists, they know so much, they're great sources, but they can't always communicate these issues very well. They tend to use jargon, acronyms, technical terms that audiences just don't understand. So it's really our job as journalists is to translate the science into a way, into a story that everyone can understand. Sometimes we talk about, imagine we're telling the story to our grandmother or to our nephew. And that's the way we have to approach it, is to make it easy to understand. And sometimes in doing that, scientists feel like we're losing out on some of the information, and that's true. But hopefully, we're not losing out on the accuracy. We're just making it easier to understand. We have a lot more tools now that we can use to tell these stories. We can use social media to do polling. We can do a lot of investigative reports. We can do a lot more with graphics now than ever before. Photos are always important. That old saying about a photo being worth 1,000 words. It's still true. Maybe even more than ever. Video. It's easier than ever now to do video and report it online. So we have a lot more tools, and we need to use them to make climate change more appealing. And we also need to avoid false balance. This is more of an issue in the U.S., where we still have significant segments of the population that don't believe climate change is happening. Although I would point out most Americans do believe it is happening and it's being caused by people. But there are some people who don't believe it, and we need to avoid what we call false balance. For instance, 97% of climate scientists believe that climate change is happening and it's being caused by people. So when we report that, we should, I believe, we should assume and accept that climate change is happening and being caused by humans. In the past, we would see some media companies, quote, balancing that view with a climate denier who would argue that climate change is not happening, and I think that is what I would consider to be false balance. We do need to be open to new views and to skepticism, genuinely constructive scientific skepticism. But just doing a he said, she said kind of balance and pretending that's neutral reporting, that in my mind is not appropriate. And we need to do a better job of reporting on adaptation. That's not always easy. Again, focusing on solutions can be a challenge in the media world, but there are ways to do it. Again, to when you're focusing on a problem, add in. There's a lot of interesting. We've been hearing some interesting stories here in Greenland about how people are adapting to climate change. I just heard an interesting story before lunch. I was talking to a researcher here at the Institute of Natural Resources, and she was talking about the problem here of thinning ice. Thinning sea ice is a big problem here in the Arctic. And she was saying that in Canada, they face a lot of problems with this because they use more snowmobiles. And of course, if you're going out on thin ice in a snowmobile, you're more likely to go through the ice. But I guess here in Greenland, there's a rule that if you're above the Arctic Circle, you have to use dog sleds. And the dogs apparently have sensors in their paws, and when they go out in the ice, they can feel when the ice is thinning, and they'll back away. That, to me, is a great way to adapt to this problem. Of course, it's not a complete solution, but these are the kinds of things we're seeing around the world. I'm still learning about how we adapt here in the Arctic. We've done a lot more reporting in places like tropical Asia, where people are using floating gardens or building storm shelters that they can go to during typhoons, or doing unique water management practices to help keep out saline water. So I'm sure people are incredibly creative and have a lot of ingenuity, and we can find these solutions to adapt. But the media can play a really important role by spreading messages, spreading those solutions around. And I just want to say that getting this kind of information is not going to solve the whole problem. In my opinion, the media, we play an important role because getting this information out is necessary, but it's not sufficient. People are not just motivated by information. They're also, what we found, again, this consumer research, they're motivated by their peers. If you see your neighbors putting solar photovoltaics on their roof, you're more likely to do it yourself. If you see them buying plug-in hybrid cars or electric vehicles, you're more likely to do that. We are social, we are herd animals, we're pack animals, and we're more likely to follow trends from our neighbors, friends, and peers. So again, information is necessary, but it's not it's not going to lead to a complete solution. Any questions before I move on? Oh. So what's your question? It's like how can we Yeah, okay. I'm going to be honest and say there's no simple solution, but basically what we need is better media literacy, right? We need to understand where our information is coming from and what the source is. And there are people grappling with this issue, but ultimately, there's not really a shortcut for, if you're getting something, if you're getting information through social media or whatever source, you have to understand what that source is and what is the motivation behind that source, right? I mean, you have trusted sources. I know I do, whether it's mainstream media outlets like New York Times or The Guardian or CNN, and then you have some sources that are going to be biased on this, like perhaps the Wall Street Journal editorial page or Fox News, and if you don't know the source of your information, then you're in danger of being misled. There are initiatives out there. Internews has a new program called United for News. Some of us are trying to think about ways to label news in a certain way, just like you label green products or fair trade products. Maybe we need to label news and accept it as there's another initiative called climate feedback. Have you guys heard of climate feedback? They actually go through stories and they rate the story as to whether it's credible, whether the information is credible. And it's not just that, it's rating them for both sides. If there are also stories that they judge to be overly alarmist in terms of climate change, as well as kind of denying that climate change is happening. So I think we need, I'm not convinced there's any real shortcuts, but media literacy is a really growing issue around the world. And I think for our kids, having 2 kids myself, I try and teach them, to look at where your information is coming from and what information you can trust. Yeah. Any other questions? I would say, in recent years, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been probably a decline in environmental journalism. A lot of environmental journalists are being laid off or we're going freelance. They're one of the first jobs to be cut when newspapers or other media are being, are running into financial problems. But actually, in the last year or two, I think there's been a huge surge in environmental journalism, largely thanks to our friend Donald Trump. And we've seen a lot of media outlets, really ramping up their coverage, especially of climate change. So it's kind of ironic how he's given a boost to this whole field. I have friends who, like Lisa Friedman, a colleague of ours who won an Earth Journalism Award at the Copenhagen Summit. She worked for a long time with a news outlet called Energy and Environment News. Fine outlet, but kind of a specialty outlet. She was hired last year by the New York Times as part of their new climate desk, which is great. She totally deserves it. She's been doing great work there, and now she's got bylines on the front page, which, for those of us who've been toiling away in this specialty field, it's a wonderful thing to see. So I think, actually, and I see this in my class at UC Berkeley, we've always had, we had interest in our class on environmental reporting, but this year we had more applications to join the class than ever before. We had over 20 applications. We can only take usually a dozen, and the students were really excited. They were really on their game. We had fantastic stories that they did, not just on climate change, but all kinds of environmental topics. So I think we've seen a real kind of resurgence in environmental reporting over the last year or two. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do at the Earth Journalism Network. We divide our mission again is to improve the quantity and quality of environmental coverage. We do that through kind of 4 main activities. Education is pretty straightforward. Whether it's through universities or training workshops, we can train journalists in covering topics like climate change or oceans or biodiversity. And these are technical subjects where the science is changing all the time. So it's not that the journalists we train are lacking in education necessarily. It's just that they need to keep up. We all need to keep up. We all need training. Sometimes we don't want to admit that. But it's really important when you're reporting on fast-changing fields like environment and natural resources. And we can tailor our workshops to specific regions, specific topics. And we work with these networks of journalists around the world. I mentioned them before, some of our partners. We'd love to be doing more work here in the Arctic. We do have some members, journalists who work in northern climates, in the northern climes, but we'd like to do a lot more. And the key to all this work really is, of course, story production. We are not a news agency ourselves. Our goal is really to boost coverage in the local media, because we believe that's what will really have an impact on policies and behaviors and have an impact on the world around us. And we support story production through story grants, and through our training as well, as part of our workshops. We'll also bring journalists to major events, the climate summits, the Convention on Biological Diversity, any kind of event where there's news, we can bring journalists there. And it's a great opportunity for them because they get both capacity building and they can produce news stories for their home audiences. And finally, we have this relatively new initiative called Geo Journalism, which is really data journalism. And I'll show you what that's about. It's basically combining visualized environmental data with interactive maps to tell stories in new ways that we weren't able to do before. So education, I already spoke about. Network journalism. One of our main initiatives is this climate change media partnership. We bring journalists to the climate summits each year. We brought them to Copenhagen. We brought them to Paris. And, we had really good results. I think we've done a survey of the journalists who participated, and 94% of them said these fellowships made them a better journalist. 90% said they became more aware about how to report on climate change. And they formed all these relationships and their contacts that have really allowed them to in some cases, take on full careers in climate journalism. So geojournalism, here are some examples of maps that we work with. Equatorials in Indonesia, Info Amazones about the Amazon. And we can tag stories to these maps. So if you're interested in a specific region, perhaps in the Arctic someday, you can go to a map, say, of the Arctic and see what's happening in Qaanaaq in northern Greenland, or in Nunavut, or in Alaska, or whatever. I think it'd be really cool, actually, to do a geojournalism site for the Arctic and collect stories there. So it'd be a great way for people in the region to see what's going on. In places like the Arctic, I've actually been struck here how similar it is to, of all places, the Pacific. Small island states in the Pacific. Of course, in terms of climate, it's completely separate, different, but they're small populations spread across huge different distances, and they're on the front row of climate change. So it's difficult for them to connect and to exchange information. But now, of course, through the internet, we can do that, and I think initiatives like geojournalism make that a lot easier. You can translate the stories into different languages like we do in the Amazon, into Spanish, Portuguese, and English. So I think it'd be really interesting to find ways to use geojournalism to help the Arctic. I'm going to be wrapping up here. Here's an example. I'm happy to talk more about these sites if you're interested. We had a site for the U.S., which similarly showed what's happening regarding climate change in the U.S. So those dots are each geotagged stories. So you can hover over the dot and you can see, for instance, this one that's this one in North Dakota is about shale gas fracking. And so it's basically aggregating these stories, and it's using the map so that you say, okay, I want to see what's happening in Idaho. So you go to Idaho and you see what stories are there. And also there's data here. You can see that those honeycomb, that's visualized data. In this case, I think it's temperature anomalies. It shows temperature anomalies. If I had the access to the internet, I could show you these sites. We can also show like heat maps to show where forest fires are occurring, or extreme weather events. we got all this environmental data out there, and reams of environmental data. We're only using something like 10% of it, and even less of that to communicate. So if we can find ways to use that data, that can provide scientific support for the stories, and then these stories provide narrative context for the data. So that's what we've been trying to do with geojournalism. It's worked really well in places like the Himalaya. We have a third site there called the Third Pole. In the Amazon, in Southeast Asia, we have a site called Mekong Eye. In South Africa, there's a site called Oxpeckers that focuses on wildlife trafficking. All these topics, you can get data and you can visualize it. And that's really the new trend in data journalism. And Rebecca Moore from Google Earth agrees that this is a future. So just to wrap up some of our impacts, we've had, in addition to the numbers, we now have, actually that number's outdated, we now have over 12,000 member journalists. We've had real impacts on the ground. We've had journalists in China uncover illegally polluting factories that were shut down by the government as a result. In Myanmar, journalists there reported on the Irrawaddy River and the big dam that China was building in the north called the Mitsone Dam. They held a series of photo exhibits. One of them, Aung San Suu Kyi, showed up, and she talked about what a mistake the dam was. This was back in 2009. And as a result of that, the government stopped this huge dam from being built in northern Myanmar. In Costa Rica, a series of stories on climate change. Again, this is about 10 years ago, before COP15 led Costa Rica to develop a national climate change strategy that included new adaptation scenarios. We uncovered a illegal wildlife smuggling ring in Cambodia and Vietnam. They were using false CITES papers from Laos to illegally capture wild macaques, wild monkeys from Cambodia, smuggle them into Vietnam, from where they were exported to the US and China for medical experiments. And we had a team of Vietnamese and Cambodian journalists who uncovered that. Also in Vietnam, a team of journalists went to a national park called Tam Dao National Park, and they discovered that the local authorities were planning an ecotourism project that was going to include a golf course and a casino. So I guess it was going to be an eco casino. They wrote it up in their newspapers, and government stepped in and they scrapped the project. So think about it. You're a young Vietnamese journalist. You have very little say in the way the country's run, but you've just saved a national park basically from being cut down. Indonesia, some journalists there have helped. They saved a peat swamp in Aceh from being developed. They stopped the poaching of an endangered species called the anoa. In Nepal, we did a series of stories as part of the Third Pole. Heather, you might be familiar with that, on the Koshi River Basin. And as a result of that, the government revived a flood warning system that they'd allowed to fall into disrepair. So this is all just to say that media has a really big influence on policies and on the environment, and we don't always know. We can't predict which stories are going to have significant results and which stories, may not. But we firmly believe that all these stories in the end do have an impact on public policy and public decision making. So, that's why we're doing this, basically. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. And I'm always happy. For those of you online, feel free to email me. And anyone else, I'm always happy to answer questions.